There's a moment in every long life when something shifts and no one announces it. One day you look around a room full of family and you realize you are now the oldest person there. Not the second oldest, not nearly the oldest, the oldest. The one people quietly look to without quite knowing why. The one whose opinion suddenly carries a different weight, even when you said the exact same thing 20 years ago and no one noticed. If you've felt that shift, if you know what it is to become the old one in your own family, I want you to know something first. No one warned you, and that's not your fault. By the end of this, I want you to understand what that role actually asks of you, what it costs, and what, surprisingly, it can still give you even now. Stay with me. This one is worth the time. I remember exactly when I noticed it. It was at my younger brother's funeral. I was 76 years old. I stood at the front of that small chapel and I looked out at the people gathered there. Nephews, nieces, cousins, my own children, and I realized something with a kind of cold clarity that I still remember precisely. I was the oldest person in that room. Not just the oldest person at the funeral, the oldest living member of my entire family. My parents were gone. My older sister had passed 11 years before. Now my younger brother, the last sibling I had, was gone too. There was no one left above me, no one older, no one who remembered our childhood the way I remembered it, who could correct me if I misremembered a detail, who carried the same shared history from the same original source. I had become, without applying for the position, without anyone formally announcing it, the old one, the head of a family that no longer had anyone ahead of me. I want to tell you what nobody tells you about that moment, because I had no idea it was coming, and I don't think most people do. It isn't really about age exactly. Plenty of people become the old one relatively young if they outlive siblings or parents early. Plenty of people don't feel it until their 80s or 90s. It's about position, about suddenly standing at the front of a line you didn't know you were in. For my entire life up to that point, there had always been someone ahead of me. My parents, obviously, for the first half of my life. Then, after they were gone, my older sister carried something of that role, not formally but in the quiet way oldest siblings sometimes do. She remembered more than I did. She had been there first. She had, in some sense, already tested the ground I was walking on. When she died, and then later my brother, that buffer disappeared. There was no one left between me and the front of the line. The first thing that changes when you become the old one is what people expect you to remember. I had always been somewhat the family historian, even before my siblings passed. I liked stories. I liked details. I was the one who remembered which uncle had done what during the war, which cousin had married into which family, which old feud had started over what now forgotten slight. But there's a difference between being a person who happens to know some family history and being the only person left who knows any of it. After my brother died, I started getting calls I had never gotten before. A grandniece writing a school paper about family heritage, calling to ask about her great-grandfather, my father, who she had never met and knew almost nothing about. A cousin's son going through a box of old photographs after his mother passed, calling because there was no one else left who could identify the people in them. I became, almost overnight, the only working key to several locked rooms of family memory. That is a strange kind of responsibility. No one asks if you want it. It simply arrives, because the alternative is that the memory disappears entirely, and something in you refuses to let that happen without a fight. I want to be honest about what this responsibility feels like, because it isn't simple. Part of it is genuinely meaningful. I have spent hours on the phone walking a grandniece through who is who in a photograph from 1958, and there is something deeply satisfying about being the bridge between a person and their own history, about making sure a name doesn't just vanish into some relative not sure who. But part of it is also lonely in a specific way, because when I tell these stories, I am the only one in the conversation who actually lived them. The people I'm talking to are receiving second-hand information, however carefully I deliver it. They didn't smell the cigar smoke in my father's study. They didn't hear the particular sound of my sister's laugh. They are getting facts. I am the one still holding the feeling underneath the facts. And when I am gone, the feeling goes with me. The facts might survive in some form, written down, passed along imperfectly, but the felt experience of that history, what it was actually like to live inside it, ends with the last person who was there. That is part of what it means to be the old one. You become, whether you wanted the job or not, the final living witness. The second thing that changes is more subtle and took me longer to name. People started treating me differently. Not badly, just differently. There's a particular kind of caution that enters how younger relatives speak to the oldest person in the family. A softening, a slight formality, even among people who love you and have known you their whole lives. I noticed it first at gatherings. Conversations would shift slightly when I entered a room, not dramatically but enough that I could feel it. Topics that had been discussed freely a moment before would get a quieter, more careful treatment. Jokes would get gentler. People would ask, more often than they used to, whether I needed anything, whether I was comfortable, whether the chair was okay, whether I'd had enough to eat. I understand where this comes from. It comes from love, mostly. From a generation of younger people who have been taught, correctly, to respect their elders and look after them. But there is a cost to it that doesn't get discussed enough. The caution, however well-intentioned, has a way of placing you slightly outside the regular flow of family life. You become someone to be looked after rather than someone fully participating, a person handled with care rather than a person simply present. It is a strange thing to be loved that carefully and feel, at the same time, slightly set apart. There's a particular moment that crystallized this for me. My grandson, now an adult with children of his own, was at my house helping me move some furniture. A simple task, nothing dramatic. But at one point he said gently, "Grandpa, why don't you let me handle that part?" and took something out of my hands that I was perfectly capable of carrying. It wasn't a big thing. He meant nothing but kindness by it. But standing there, watching him take the box from my hands with a careful, protective expression, I understood something about what had shifted. I was no longer simply a man helping move furniture. I was now the old one being helped. The role had changed, quietly, somewhere along the way, without any specific moment I could point to as the turning point. And once you notice that shift, you start noticing it everywhere, in how people speak to you, in what they assume you can and can't do, in the slight adjustment of expectation that surrounds you like weather. I want to talk about something that is harder to say out loud because it sounds like complaining, and I don't mean it that way. Being the old one sometimes means being consulted less, even as you are respected more. When I was younger, in my 50s and 60s, when my own parents were still alive but I had become a senior figure in my immediate family, people asked my opinion about real decisions, where to invest, how to handle a difficult situation at work, what to do about a struggling marriage. As I've gotten older, the questions have changed. People still respect me. They still, I believe, value my presence, but they ask me fewer practical questions and offer me more careful reassurances. They tell me about their decisions after they've made them rather than asking what I think before. They protect me from worry rather than including me in problem solving. Some of this is appropriate. Some decisions genuinely aren't mine to weigh in on anymore, and I don't resent that. But some of it, I think, comes from an unspoken assumption that the very old have less to contribute to active decision-making, that our value has shifted entirely into the past tense, into memory and history and stories rather than into the present and future. That assumption isn't entirely true, and living inside it for years without saying anything can make a person feel useful only as an artifact rather than as a participant. I don't want to leave you with only the difficult parts because there is something genuinely valuable in this position too, and I had to go looking for it deliberately before I found it. About 2 years after my brother died, my grandson came to me with a real problem, not a courtesy visit. An actual decision he was wrestling with, whether to take a risk in his career that could either set his family up well or set them back significantly. He didn't ask me the way people sometimes ask the old one a question out of politeness, already planning to do what they intended regardless. He asked because he genuinely wanted to know what I thought, having lived through several decades of decisions of my own, some of which had worked out, and some of which had not. I told him honestly. I told him about a similar choice I had made at his age, what I had gotten right, what I had gotten badly wrong, and what I wished someone had told me at the time. He sat with that for a long time. Then he made his decision, not the one I would have made, as it turned out, but his own, informed by what I had shared. That conversation reminded me of something I had nearly forgotten in the fog of being protected and looked after. I still have something to offer that comes only from having lived this long. Not nostalgia, not stories for their own sake, actual usable perspective, earned the hard way, available to anyone willing to ask for it seriously. The position of the old one is not only about being cared for, it can also be about being consulted, if you make yourself available for real consultation rather than only ceremonial respect. I started doing something a few years ago that I think mattered more than I expected it to. I began writing things down, not a formal memoir, nothing grand, just notebooks kept loosely where I recorded the stories I knew were going to disappear with me if I didn't put them somewhere outside my own head. What my father's voice sounded like when he was angry, and the rare specific things that made him that way. The exact sequence of events during a particular hard year in our family that none of the official versions, told at holidays, ever quite captured correctly. The private jokes my sister and I had that meant nothing to anyone else and would simply vanish if I didn't write down at least the shape of them. I am not under any illusion that these notebooks will preserve the felt experience the way I described earlier. They won't. The feeling dies with the last person who carried it. But the facts, the sequence, the texture of what happened, those can survive if someone takes the time to put them down before the last living witness is gone. Writing this down did something for me that I hadn't expected. It made the weight of being the only one left feel less like an emergency and more like a project, something with an action attached to it rather than simply a fact to carry around helplessly. I also started doing something that took me longer to feel comfortable with. I started letting people record me. My grandson asked, about a year ago, if he could record some of our conversations just on his phone, nothing elaborate. He said he wanted his own children someday to be able to hear my actual voice telling these stories, not just a second-hand version retold by someone else. My first instinct was to say no. It felt strange, performative somehow in a way that made me uncomfortable. But I said yes, and I am glad I did. There is something different about a recorded voice than a written page. The hesitations are still there, the specific way I emphasize certain words, the small laugh before a particular memory, things that don't survive transcription. If you are the old one in your family, and someone asks to record you, even if it feels strange, even if some part of you resists it, I would gently encourage you to say yes, not because you need to perform your own legacy, but because the version of you that exists only in your particular voice with your particular pauses is a kind of evidence that nothing else can replace. Something shifted in me once I started thinking of myself less as someone simply waiting to be cared for, and more as someone with a specific, useful role that only I could fill. I started bringing stories to gatherings more deliberately instead of waiting to be asked, not performing, just offering, the way you might offer a dish you'd made, knowing some people would want it. I started answering the careful, protective questions, "Are you comfortable, Grandpa?" And then often following them with something else, a story, a question of my own about what was happening in their lives, a way of pulling the conversation back toward mutual exchange rather than one-directional care. It didn't eliminate the caution people showed me. That caution, I think, is simply part of how families treat their oldest members now, and there's love underneath most of it that I don't want to dismiss. But it added something alongside the caution, A sense that I was still in some active way part of the conversation rather than only its subject. I visit my brother's grave a few times a year, my sister's too when I can manage the longer drive. I want to be honest about what those visits feel like because I think it matters. There is a particular loneliness in standing at the graves of the people who knew you before anyone else did. The people who remembered you as a child, who shared your specific family's particular sense of humor, who didn't need anything explained to them because they had simply been there. That loneliness doesn't go away. I don't think it's supposed to, but I have learned that it sits alongside something else now, something I didn't expect to find at this age, a kind of quiet pride in still being here, in still being useful, in whatever modified way usefulness looks like now, in still having something to give the people who are still here with me, even though the people who came before are gone. Both things are true. The loneliness of being last, and the value of still being present. If you have become the old one in your family, if you are the last living member of your generation, the keeper of memories no one else carries, the person whose stories people may listen to politely but rarely ask for directly anymore, I want to tell you plainly what I have come to believe. You are not just a relic of the past, even if it sometimes feels that way. You are the only living bridge between people who are gone and people who are still arriving. That position is not nothing. It is in fact one of the most important roles a family can have even when no one formally names it. But it requires something from you too. It requires you to offer what you have, sometimes without being asked, to write things down, to say yes when someone wants to record your voice, to answer the careful, protective questions and then add something more, a story, a question, a piece of yourself that keeps you a participant rather than only a subject of concern. The position was given to you without your consent. What you do with it is still very much your choice. I am 79 years old now. I am still the old one. I expect I will be for whatever years remain to me. There is no younger relative coming up behind me to take that particular position back. But I have stopped experiencing it only as a burden, and I have stopped experiencing it only as an honor. It is both. Most important things in a long life usually are. What I know now, that I didn't know standing in that chapel at my brother's funeral, is that being the last one doesn't mean being the least useful one. It means being the one who remembers. The one who can still answer the question if someone is willing to ask it seriously, the one whose voice, recorded or written or simply spoken across a kitchen table, is the last living thread to a history that would otherwise have nowhere left to go. That is worth something. I have come to believe that firmly. It is worth quite a lot, actually. If something in this reached you today, if you know what it is to be the old one or you can see that day coming toward you, I'd like to hear from you. Leave a comment. Tell me what you remember that no one else does. Tell me what you've started doing with that memory, if anything. These conversations matter more than people think. I'd like this channel to be a place where we actually have them. If this speaks to you, please subscribe. We're here every week talking honestly about what these years actually involve. Thank you for staying with me through this one. It was a longer conversation than most, and I appreciate you giving it the time.